Well, we heard from President Obama earlier today, speaking at the UN General Assembly in New York. Now it's the Russian President Vladimir Putin's turn. On the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, it's a good occasion, a good opportunity to take stock of history and talk about our common future. In 1945, the countries that defeated Nazism joined together to make solid foundations for the post-war world order. But may I remind you that the key decisions on the principles guiding cooperation among states, as well as the establishment
Ялтинская система была действительно выстрадана, оплачена жизнью миллионов людей двумя мировыми войнами, которые прокатились по планете в 20 веке.
The loss of tens of millions of lives in 2 world wars.
Помогла человечеству
Let us be fair.
через бурные, порой драматические события последних 70-летий. Уберегла мир.
United Nations has helped humanity through turbulent events of the last 7 decades. The United Nations is unique in its legitimacy, its representation and universality. It's true that recently the UN has been widely criticized for supposedly not being efficient enough, and for the fact that the decision-making on fundamental issues stalls due to insurmountable issues. However, I would like to point out that there have always been differences in the UN throughout these 70 years of existence. The veto right has always been exercised by the US, the UK, France, China, the Soviet Union and latterly Russia. It's perfectly natural for such a diverse organization. When the UN was established, its founders did not think that there would be unanimity. The mission of the organization is to reach compromises, and its strength comes from taking different views and opinions into consideration. Decisions taken at the UN are taken as resolutions or not. Whatever actions any state might take bypassing this procedure are illegitimate and against the UN Charter, against international law. We all know that after the end of the Cold War, everyone's aware of it, a single center of domination emerged in the world, and those who found themselves at the top of the pyramid were tempted to think that if they were so strong and exceptional, they knew better. They didn't have to reckon with the UN, which instead of authorizing the necessary decisions, often created obstacles or stood in the way. It's now become commonplace to see that in its original form, it's become obsolete and completed its historical mission. Of course, the world is changing, and the UN must be consistent with this natural transformation. Russia stands ready to work together with its partners on the basis of consensus. But we consider attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the UN as extremely dangerous. They could lead to the collapse of the whole architecture of international relations. And if that ended, there would be no other rules left. But the rule of force, we would have a world dominated by selfishness rather than collective work, a world increasingly characterized by dictate rather than by equality. There would be less democracy and freedom, and a world where true independent states would be replaced by de facto protectorates.
свободного выбора своей судьбы для каждого человека.
The UN is basically about freedom and the right for everyone to choose their own future.
В этом же ряду и вопрос о так
Dear
называемой
colleagues,
легитимности
the
государственной.
same holds true of the
Нельзя
question of the legitimacy of state authorities.
в международных делах каждый текст
Words should not be manipulated.
прозрачен, должен иметь единообразное.
Every term in international law should be clear and transparent,
Мы все разные. И к этому нужно
uniformly understood with its criteria. We're all different and we should respect that.
развитие. Признанную
No one has to conform to a single development model
не стоит забывать опыта прошлого.
that someone has recognized as the only right one. We should all remember what our past has taught us.
Экспорт
We
социальных
should also remember certain episodes from the history of the Soviet Union,
или иных странах, исходя из
social experiments
часто приводили к трагическим последствиям. Приводили не к прогрессу,
often led to tragic consequences and to degradation rather than progress. It seems, however, that far from learning from others' mistakes, everyone just keeps repeating
так
them.
называемых демократических,
And so the export of revolutions, this time so-called democratic ones, continues. We just need to look at the situation in the Middle East and North Africa.
политические,
This has been
социальные
mentioned
проблемы.
by
В этом
the
регионе
previous speaker.
И люди там, конечно,
Problems have been piling up in this region for a long time.
но что
The
получилось?
people there wanted changes, naturally.
Агрессивные внешние,
But how did it actually turn out?
что вместо реформ государственные институты
Rather than bringing about reforms,
были просто
aggressive foreign interference has resulted in the destruction of national institutions and the lifestyle itself. Instead of democracy and progress, we have violence, poverty, and social disaster. But nobody cares a bit about human rights, including the right to life.
ситуацию.
I can't help asking those who've caused this situation, do you realize now what you've done?
Повиснет в воздухе. Потому что
But I'm afraid no one's going to answer that.
уверенность, убежденность в своей
Indeed,
исключительности
policies based on self-conceit and belief in one's exceptionality and impunity have never been abandoned.
Востока и
It's now obvious
вакуум власти привел к образованию
that the power vacuum created in certain countries in the Middle East and North Africa
экстремистами и террористами. Под знаменами так
was
называемого
filled by extremists and terrorists.
десятки тысяч боевиков.
Tens of thousands of militants are fighting under the banners of the so-called Islamic State. Its ranks include former Iraqi servicemen who were thrown out into the street after the invasion of Iraq in
В
2003.
результате грубого нарушения резолюции 1973 Совбеза ООН.
In Libya, country's statehood was destroyed,
Называемой умеренной сирийской оппозиции
and now the ranks of radicals have been joined
вооружают
by members of the so-called moderate Syrian opposition supported by Western countries.
исламского государства. Да и само исламское
They are
государство
armed and trained and then they defect to the so-called Islamic State. Besides, the Islamic State itself didn't just come from nowhere. It was initially forged as a tool against undesirable
государство активно расширяет
secular forces.
на другие регионы.
The
Нацеливает
Islamic State has become
и не только
is actively exporting to other regions, seeking dominance in the Islamic world.
ограничиваются.
And not only there,
Положение дел
its plans go further than that.
в такой
The
ситуации
situation is more than dangerous. In these circumstances, it is hypocritical and irresponsible to make loud declarations about the threat of international terrorism while turning a blind eye to the channels of financing and supporting terrorists, including
либо пытаться манипулировать экстремистскими
the
группировками
illicit trade in arms. It's equally irresponsible to try to manipulate these groups and place them at one's service
с ними, а попросту
in the hope of later dealing with them,
тем, кто действительно
or in other words, liquidating them.
думает. Хотел
To those who do so,
уважаемые,
I would like to say,
вы имеете
dear sirs,
с очень жестокими людьми.
no doubt you are dealing with rough and cruel people, but
Они
they are
глупее вас. И
not
еще не
primitive or stupid. They're just as clever as you are. and you never know who is manipulating whom. There's data on the arms transferred to the most moderate opposition. That's the best proof of this. We believe that any attempts to play games with terrorists, let alone to arm them, are not only short-sighted, but they are hazardous. This may result in the global terrorist threat increasing dramatically and engulfing new regions, especially given that Islamic State camps train militants from many countries, including the European countries. Unfortunately, dear colleagues, I have to put it frankly, Russia is not an exception. We cannot allow these criminals who have already tasted blood back home to continue their evil doings. No one wants this to happen, do they? Russia has always been consistently fighting these terrorists in all its forms. Today we provide assistance to Iraq and Syria, and many other countries in the region are fighting terrorist groups. We think it's an enormous mistake to refuse to cooperate with the Syrian government and its armed forces, who are fighting terrorism face to face. We should finally acknowledge that. No one but President Assad's armed forces and the Quds militia are truly fighting the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in Syria. We know about all the problems and contradictions in the region. Dear colleagues, I must note that such an honest and frank approach by Russia has been used as a pretext to accuse Russia of having growing ambitions, as though those who say it have no ambitions of their own. However, it's not about Russia's ambitions, dear colleague, but it's about the recognition of the fact that we can no longer tolerate the current state of affairs in the world. What we're actually proposing is to be guided by common values and common interests rather than by ambitions. On the basis of international law, we must join together our efforts to address the problems that we are all facing and to create a broad international coalition against terrorism, similar to the anti-Hitler coalition that united a broad range of forces that were resolutely resisting those who are just like the Nazis, evil. Naturally, the Muslim countries are to play a key role in this coalition, even more so because the Islamic State does not only pose a direct threat to them, but also desecrates one of the greatest world religions by its bloody crimes. The ideologies of militants make a mockery of Islam and pervert its true humanistic values. I would like to address the Muslim leaders as well. Your authority and your guidance are of great importance right now. It's essential to prevent people recruited by militants from making hasty decisions. And those who've already been deceived due to various circumstances and found themselves among terrorists, they need help in finding a way back to normal life and to lay down arms and put an end to fratricide. Russia will shortly convene, as current President of the Security Council, a meeting to carry out a comprehensive analysis of the threats in the Middle East. First of all, we propose discussing whether it's possible to agree on a resolution aimed at coordinating the actions of all the forces that confront Islamic State and other terrorist organizations. Once again, this coordination should be based on the principles of the UN Charter. We hope that the international community will be able to develop a comprehensive strategy to help the Middle East. Then, dear friends, there would be no need for new refugee camps. Today, the flow of people who are forced to leave their homelands has engulfed neighboring countries and now Europe itself. There are hundreds of thousands of them now, and there may be millions before long. In fact, it's a new, great and tragic migration of peoples, and it's a harsh lesson for all of us, including Europe. I would like to stress that refugees undoubtedly need our compassion and support. However, the only way to solve this problem at a fundamental level is to restore the statehood where it's been destroyed, to strengthen the government institutions where they still exist or are being re-established, to provide comprehensive assistance of military, economic nature, and to those people who, despite their ordeals, will not abandon their homes. We must offer assistance. Everything in this field that is being done must be done under international law. Everything that contravenes the UN Charter must be rejected. Above all, I believe it's of the utmost importance to help restore government institutions in Libya, support a new government in Iraq, and provide comprehensive assistance to the legitimate government of Syria. Dear colleagues, ensuring peace and regional and global stability remains the key objective of the international community, with the UN at its helm. This is not for the select few, but for everyone. Yes, it's a challenging and time-consuming task, but there are no alternatives. The thinking of the times of the Cold War, however, is still present among some of our colleagues. First, they continue their policy of expanding NATO. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and nevertheless NATO continued expanding. Not only its military infrastructure, but then former Soviet countries' choice. Should they choose the West or the East? Sooner or later, confrontation was bound to ensue, and this is exactly what happened in Ukraine, where the discontent of the population with the current authorities was used, and a military coup was orchestrated from outside. We get a civil war as a result. Only through full and faithful implementation of the Minsk agreements of February can we put an end to this bloodshed. Ukraine's territorial integrity cannot be ensured by threats of force of arms. What we need is respect for the choice of the people of the eastern Donbass region. These steps will guarantee that Ukraine will develop as a civilized state, with economic cooperation in both Europe and Eurasia. Ladies and gentlemen, I've mentioned these common spaces of economic cooperation on purpose. Not so long ago, it seemed that in the economic sphere, we learned to live with dividing lines. We would build on transparent principles, including the WTO principles about open competition. Over the last period, unilateral sanctions have become almost commonplace to pursue political objectives as a means of eliminating competitors. I would like to point out another side of the growing selfishness. Our countries have chosen to create closed and exclusive economic associations, negotiated behind the scenes in secret. Other states whose interests may be affected are not informed. It seems we are about to be faced with a fait accompli, that the rules of the game have been changed in favor of the privileged, with the WTO having no say. This could unbalance the trade system completely and disintegrate the global economic space. These issues affect all states and influence the future of the world economy as a whole. That's why we propose discussing them within the UN, WTO and G20. Russia proposes harmonizing regional economic projects. This is the integration of integrations. As an example, I would like to cite our plans to interconnect the Eurasian Economic Union and China's Silk Road economic belt. We still believe that harmonizing the integration process
Дамы и господа,
between the Eurasian Union and the European Union is highly promising.
такой вызов, как глобальные изменения.
Issues that affect all people include global climate change. It's in our interests to make the UN Climate Change Conference to be held in December in Paris a success. As part of our national contribution, we plan to reduce by 2030 the greenhouse gas emissions to 70–75% of the 1990 level. I suggest, however, that we should take a broader view of this issue. Yes, we might diffuse the problem for a while by setting quotas on harmful emissions or by taking other measures, but we will not solve it that way. We need a completely different approach. We have to focus on introducing fundamental and new technologies that will not damage the environment, but will be in harmony with it. Also, this would allow us to restore the balance between the biosphere and the technosphere. This is indeed a challenge of planetary dimensions, but I'm confident that humankind has the intellectual capacity to address it. We need to join our efforts together. First of all, the states that have a solid research basis and those that have made significant advances in fundamental science. We propose convening a special forum under UN auspices for comprehensive consideration of the issues at stake. Russia would be ready to co-sponsor such a forum. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it was on the 10th of January 1946 in London that the UN General Assembly gathered for its first session. Mr. Angel, a Colombian diplomat, opened the session by giving, I believe, a concise definition of the basic principles that the UN should follow, which include free will and a spirit of cooperation. This should serve as guidance for all of us. Russia believes in the huge potential of the United Nations, which should help us avoid a new global confrontation and engage in strategic cooperation. Together with other countries, we will consistently work towards strengthening the central coordinating role of the UN. I'm confident that by working together, we will make the world stable and safe, as well as provide conditions for the development of all states and nations. Thank you. Russian President Vladimir Putin there. And just as we heard strong criticism of Russian foreign policy from President Obama a little earlier, so we have strong criticism of US policy, notably the interventions in Iraq and in Libya by the Russian leader Vladimir Putin, making his first appearance at the UN General Assembly in a decade.